You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I'm Dustin and Tony is with me and we're here to discuss all the latest news from your streaming services from May 28th through June 2nd. And it has not been a small week of news in any way, shape, or form. Now, we don't have an actual ton of individual news articles like we typically do, but there is a lot to discuss. So some of this stuff we may breeze right through. Some of it, there are things that we might come back to next week and discuss it more at length. But there is a lot of things to talk about, specifically with HBO Max. There's some stuff with Amazon and HBO Max combined. And then there's some stuff with Apple and some other companies. But the big stuff we're going to dive deep into. So let's start off with Netflix. The School for Good and Evil, which is that is going to be adapted, coming from Paul Feig at Netflix. There's also a Sundance documentary called Disclosure, which has been acquired by Netflix, which will premiere in the month of June. Jumping over to Prime Video, Amazon is looking for stronger relationships with media companies. Specifically, there is some word on the street that they're looking for large media companies to join Amazon Publisher Services. And the gist behind this is that while Amazon has the Prime subscription service, which is ad-free, they obviously also offer a variety of channels through Prime Video that you can subscribe to through Prime, similar to the way Apple TV Plus or Roku does, where if you subscribe to a service within their platform, they actually get some sort of a bounty of some sort. Sometimes it's a split of the amount of money that actually comes in. It could be an 80-20 split, a 70-30 split, depending on what the terms of the deal are. But there's also the other part of it, which is Amazon also owns IMDb TV, which they've now turned into their form of ad-supported free video streaming, similar to the way we've seen Zumo and Tubi and even Roku has elements of this. The gist is that there is obviously a huge market for content that is ad-supported, that is completely free. People with an internet connection, they don't always necessarily want to have to pay for streaming services, but they do obviously want to absorb content. So the options is the AVOD stuff, which is the advertising video on demand, and that stuff specifically is where IMDb TV is at, and Amazon is looking at that as an opportunity to make a bunch of money on top of the subscription service that they already have with Prime. So it's similar in the sense of how Comcast has Peacock and they're treating it as a subscription service, but then they also have advertising within Peacock. But then at the same time, they also just recently acquired Zumo. So the thing is, this is a huge opportunity for money. We are going to talk more about the media companies in general as far as how things are turning, and some comments coming from some execs within HBO Max talking about the world of streaming and how it's not necessarily a streaming war, but a difference of how content is acquired by the consumer. And that is a huge opportunity for a lot of money, especially with AVOD opportunities. And in the article, it actually mentions there's about $25 billion in ad revenue between broadcast and digital media. And that's a huge chunk of money that obviously anybody in their right mind wants to get a piece of. In some ways, all the major companies at this point have some sort of way of getting that, probably except for Warner Media, just because they don't have an ad-supported version yet, but we do know that's coming to HBO Max sometime in the near future. But like Disney has Hulu, they have an ad-supported version. They have live TV options where they obviously get a small amount of that ad revenue as well. You've got Zumo and the smaller tiers at Peacock for Comcast. You've got ad-supported at CBS All Access. There's ad-supported at almost every single one of them. Netflix is probably the only other one that doesn't have anything, because obviously they're focused specifically on the subscription side of it. But this is a big deal in general, and it looks like Amazon's trying to hitch their horse to someone they already have an existing deal with Disney. That's what the article is talking about, because obviously at the same time, they're also at a slight conflict right now with Warner Media because of the situation that we've got going on with HBO Max not being available on Amazon devices. It's interesting to see Amazon leaning towards Disney Plus because they have an existing relationship, and how that could change things for the future for other media companies going forward.
Yeah, the more I think about this deal, the more I think about this piece of news, the more it makes sense. Amazon wants to, kind of how they do business in their other domains, is they want to own the entire stack. So any part of the video streaming side, they want to be a player in that and make money, obviously, off of that. There are multiple different ways, but they're totally killing it right now with their Prime Video subscription model. I mean, obviously, Prime Video is doing great, massive growth, cool projects that they've bid on. I mean, it's a really mature service, and especially in the United States, it's definitely one of the top. I don't think if it's in numbers one of the top streaming providers, but it's definitely, it's got that household name and recognition, and that's great. They also are one of the major players in streaming devices with their Fire products, the Fire stick and whatnot. That's a really good competitor against Roku and Apple TV and those devices. It also licenses out its operating system for TVs and other devices not made by them. So they own a lot of the hardware. They own the OS that runs the apps for streaming. They own a subscription model that works pretty well. And now they're trying to get into the ad space. And you're right. This idea of Prime channels, it makes a lot of sense and a great way to earn extra money, and that they can also get a pie, get a little bit of piece of that pie in terms of streaming ad revenue. So this makes sense for Amazon, and I'm curious how this is going to affect their relationships with other streaming providers or content creators in contract negotiations. I mean, part of this is HBO Max jumped the gun a little bit, but they're kind of in a little bit of a skirmish right now with Amazon over this type of stuff. So I'm curious how this is going to affect their streaming partners going forward. But from an Amazon perspective, it totally makes sense for them as a business, given their reputation of what they've done in the past. But then also for them moving forward is that they want to be a player in the space and kind of de-risk themselves just from one tech line to another.
All right, so then moving on to Hulu. Real quick, Hulu has launched a watch party feature. Now, this is something that's obviously popped up not just specifically on Hulu. Now, specifically, you both have to be subscribed to a service. It's not like you can just watch the same content from somebody else on their phone. Obviously, you can figure out ways of doing that, but that's not what the watch party feature entails. It's entailed where you both log on at the same time. Within the app itself, you can watch a show together. But this is something that's popped up on a variety of different streaming services, or at least been available to use with a variety of different streaming services over the course of the past few months. And I imagine something like this is eventually probably going to come to most streaming services as time progresses, especially as we are continuing to be in a world where it's probably not the best idea to spend a ton of time outside. And as a streaming service, you obviously want to encourage people to stay inside and use your product. So that being said, that is what Hulu currently launched right now.
There have been other ways to do watch parties. One of them that I've done is just you both call each other on the phone and say go, and you start the same thing at the same time, and then you just stay on the phone the entire time. That's like super old school, but it gets the job done. I know that there are different browser extensions that allow you to do Netflix and I think maybe Prime, but certain ones out there for Firefox and Chrome and whatnot. It makes sense given where people are out today, and then in the future as more people probably be watching content from afar, with loved ones, or your remote working or something. I don't know. I could see this feature really getting big. I know some people are going to be like, well, why haven't they launched it sooner? And from a tech side, just to explain a little bit, this is very hard. I mean, you're streaming video. That's a hard problem to solve. And then, you're doing real time chat. And that's another hard thing to solve as well. So I understand why it's taken a long time to get there. I mean, we all know that like COVID-19 happened, became on the scene, January and whatnot. It just takes a while to introduce. So I just wanted to just make people aware that some software stuff just takes a while and it's just hard. And it makes sense why it's just on the web app, just because it's one of the main areas where you can watch a television show but then also text at the same time because you have the keyboard right there. It's kind of like a natural fit. I mean, half the time I have something pulled up and I'm watching it while I'm also like coding away and working. So that makes a lot of sense. The other platform where you could do that easily is probably like an iPad or some other type of tablet where you still have the screen space to do it. So that's why I don't see it moving to a Roku or Apple TV Plus, to mobile phones yet, just because that feature, it's how's that going to work? Like, how often do you really do watch parties in that type of way? So I'm curious to see how this is going to go. I understand the rollout and it being slow and limited with the amount of users using this feature, just how they're going to expose that. But then also as they scale up is, okay, what is the best design choice like moving forward for these different platforms that people watch streaming content on, like phones, a Roku TV? Like, how is that interactive nature going to work? And sometimes it might not work at all. And their engineers will decide that. But overall, I'm happy for Hulu that they're experimenting and at least trying to go out of their way to offer a better experience for people as things are hard right now, and that we want to try to stay involved even if we might be socially distant, that we could still kind of share that same moment together and we could chat and stuff. So that's really cool. I really appreciate Hulu for doing that.
All right, so there's nothing for CBS All Access, Apple TV Plus. There's a Hedy Lamarr series, which is starring Gal Gadot, which was originally planned to land at Showtime. It is now moving over to Apple instead. And then also, Apple has announced that they are teaming with Martin Scorsese for his next film, Killers of the Flower Moon. Now, what's crazy about this piece of news is that Apple spent $180 million on this project. And if you remember correctly, just last week we were talking about the Tom Hanks project Greyhound, where they spent $70 million on that, and we thought that was an insane amount of money for a single movie. And here we are, another project a week later that's even more than double the cost of the last project we were saying. So ultimately, Apple's clearly on a spending spree to get a variety of different projects. When it comes to movies, it is kind of like a one and done situation. But I guess if they're really hurting for content and they're not able to find a lot of existing content to add to their library, I guess if you have the money, spend it. I think it's not a great idea to be spending a bunch of money on movies like this, because while obviously The Irishman was at least in some ways successful for Netflix, it could not have been as successful as it might have been because Netflix didn't clearly go back to Martin Scorsese and purchase this film from him. So it begs the question of whether or not projects like this that are as expensive as this are actually worth it for a service that focuses so heavily on streaming it and the retention of customers.
We just got last episode how we talked about how the Tom Hanks film cost so much, and then now we hear this. I don't know what to think. I guess it's a little bit. I'm happy for the content because I think it's going to make me want to pay attention to Apple TV more, that they have these types of movies, but they're trying to spin their way out of a huge problem of people just not adopting their service, and they're taking the approach of, hey, we're just going to throw a bunch of money at the problem, and then maybe we can pull ourselves out of where we are. That is one way to, I think, solve the problem. From the point of economics, I understand that, is that they're going to spend more to draw in customers and get people to watch their content. I'm just a little worried that they're paying so much money for these huge projects that are just movies. Like, they're not television shows. They're not episodic in any nature. It's just a 2 to 3 hour feature film, which is great. I mean, I love these types of movies, but it's not going to keep people staying engaged for multiple different weeks. You know, the main thing is, if you look at The Mandalorian, you could probably do that in a very huge movie, but they broke it down to different chapters to get you to stay involved in the content. And people stayed every single week for like 7, 8 weeks, 9 weeks. They were engaged, and there's a huge amount of online buzz for the platform that helped sell it even more. Like, there's a reason why these streaming companies love episodic television, is because it gets people engaged for a long time. And I'm worried for Apple TV because they focus mostly on feature films as of late. That's their new biggest draw. And yeah, they have episodic content, but it's kind of seems like it's being pushed in the back burner. So I'm just concerned for the future of Apple TV, because I understand how they're moving forward, but at a certain point, these price points are going to be unsustainable, especially internally with shareholders and whatnot. But then just externally, like, it's going to inflate the market. I don't know. There's a whole lot of things that could be discussed here with Apple TV. I'm just worried that the best course of action for them still is going to just ruin them. It seems that they have no other choice but to spin their way out of their hole right now, but that might come back to bite them in the future.
I think the biggest thing with Apple TV at this point is that they have the money and they're spending the money. But I think the problem is that I honestly believe that Apple TV Plus has at least a bright future within the next couple of years, because we've heard a number of exclusive deals that they have with a variety of different production companies and producers and things like that. There's a lot of content that will be coming down the pipeline in the near future when for Apple TV Plus. The issue is, obviously, we've got production halts right now that are occurring across the world, so that's obviously preventing second seasons of certain shows that they premiered at launch from filming. They've got other projects that they're in the process of working on too that are in hold, but then there's obviously going to be other content from a lot of these content creators that they've signed exclusive deals with within the last couple months since they launched. So the thing is, I honestly believe that there's a ton of content that's eventually going to be at Apple TV Plus. It's just this slow burn of they launched with probably just not enough to consistently release. Put aside the pandemic, it's just I don't know that they had enough content to have a launch as successful as they really needed to. I mean, I honestly believe there's, like I've said before, there's a number of projects that I've seen trailers for, that I've heard really good things about, that I really do want to check out on Apple TV Plus. It's just a matter of, is there enough content? If I end up getting Apple TV Plus and I watch 3 or 4 shows, am I going to keep subscribing to it just because I know that there could be content coming? Well, I don't know. I mean, honestly, we haven't heard a whole lot of content coming from Apple TV Plus in the near future. So it really just comes down to, obviously, they need to get more content and they need to do it quickly, because the other problem is, at the come around November, when the year is up in November for the year-long subscription that a lot of the Apple customers got for free, what's going to keep them around? And if they don't find content to immediately fill that void, those people are not going to continue to subscribe, and then the large number of subscribers that they potentially have is going to dwindle very quickly, just because there's not anything there drawing or keeping the subscribers that they have and then turning them into paying subscribers. So I honestly think that while in the next 1, 2, 3 years, there's probably going to be a lot of great content and a much more consistent release schedule for Apple TV Plus, it's just a matter of getting to that point. It's like the early days of HBO. Obviously, they didn't have multiple shows premiering new episodes every single week. When HBO first started, they only had maybe 1 or 2 that premiered every single weekend, and then they would license rights to the films, and that's what they were probably best known for a really long time, was the fact that they had films that were available way closer to the launch of them being in the theaters, rather than having to go to the rental stores and renting the films on VHS back in the day. So I think this is Apple's version of a slow launch or a slow build, but I think the problem is that everyone's looking at it and expecting them to get big real quick, and Apple is clearly very committed. They're spending an insane amount of money on some of these projects, but it does come across as you just kind of have to wait you have to wait for Apple TV Plus to get a little bit bigger than it is. So we'll see what happens. All right, Disney Plus. Disney Plus is heading to Japan on June 11th. That's not a surprise. We knew it was coming in June, but now we have an official date. Japan has a huge affinity for Disney, so it'll be interesting to see how that actually works out. But I imagine the launch will probably go without any hiccups, specifically because they haven't really had any major issues within the European countries it has launched in, as well as India. We haven't heard a lot. Obviously, we're not in those countries, but I personally did not see anything on Twitter talking about how there was issues with the launches, so I imagine it should go seamlessly. But Japan is a big market and is for Disney in general, so we'll see what happens there. Frozen 2 is heading to the UK and Ireland 2 weeks early. And finally, The Simpsons are now viewable in their original aspect ratio. You might remember at the very beginning of Disney Plus launching, they were available in widescreen format only, or the standard format, which was cutting off some of the actual picture. There was a lot of people who raised some concerns. Disney said that they were working on figuring it out. The biggest thing here is that the reason why it took so long is because they basically had to rework the entire idea of how to view this content in its original aspect ratio. I remember I read an interview that was talking about how exactly they made this happen, and it was basically they could not just simply put in all the other versions of the show in the original aspect ratio, because that would create duplicates of the same episode. So they needed to rebuild the interface to allow an option to basically allow you to view it just by simply toggling the switch, so they wouldn't have duplicate episodes appearing within the library and things like that. So it was a complicated process. It was well explained why it took as long as it did, and I can honestly say that the effort that they put into it was probably more than the return that they will get out of it.
Definitely. I mean, I read the article and I appreciated how in-depth it was. I mean, usually we hear, software updates or something back in to allow different things to happen, and you're just like, oh, okay, whatever. But I really appreciated how detailed they were, because usually they're not. And yeah, the process was super complex, and I'm surprised that they were able to do it without any downtime. I mean, there are probably a few outages here or there, but it seems like, checking the Twitter sphere and, the different blogs that we checked, that there wasn't any huge outages as they unleashed this new feature. So congrats to the Disney Plus dev team. I think that's really impressive that they're able to do this. And just as the big scope of the whole entire project, I mean, it's just, you can read the article in the show notes. Just a lot of things had to move and change and fundamentally shift. And it just shows once again that, like, it's hard to plan all possible, futures. The default assumption probably going into these dev meetings was, hey, there's just going to be one way to watch content. Well, that's not true. Maybe you're going to get different aspect ratios. Like, that's really hard to think about in the future. So I appreciate the Disney Plus team for finding a good solution that didn't break their service. So,
all right. So then jumping over to Quibi, there's a couple of things. Cynthia Arivio she's fronting a docuseries called What We Keep that's coming to Quibi. And then Quibi's programming is getting completely revamped in hopes of attracting more subscribers. This article is actually over on Bloomberg from Lucas Shaw, and this one is more in depth about what is happening within Quibi. So they've canceled, or I guess not renewed, certain shows that launched with the service. One of them is the Elba vs. Block series starring Idris Elba, and that show is not getting renewed. There's a number of other shows that are supposedly not getting renewed, and then there's a number of shows that are actually being potentially retooled for the second season so that they could potentially work better for subscribers. There's no real word on exactly what they're planning, because a lot of this is kind of hush-hush at the moment because they don't want to make it extremely clear what's going on. However, the one thing that's not mentioned in the article, which I read, but I cannot remember where the article was, and now that I'm thinking about it, it's not going to be in the show notes, but I'll randomly mention it. There's a rumor going around that the advertisers that Quibi has already, sold the ad blocks to for the rest of 2020, the advertisers are actually starting to go back to Quibi and demand a new rate on their ad buys because of the specific lack of subscribers that they have. So that's obviously not good. So obviously Quibi is going to be trying to shift a lot of different things around to make it work. And as things start to open back up, hopefully they can gain some more subscribers. I honestly don't think it's going to happen, but one can only hope that a service can do a complete turnaround. It hasn't been done to this point, but we will see.
I would hate to be Quibi right now. This does not bode well for me. Just hearing that they're revamping their entire catalog, since a large amount of things just aren't hitting with their consumers that they wanted. I mean, first off, they're not reaching the consumers that they thought they would. It's Quibi's, original audience that they were going for, more millennials, more younger. But, quoting this Bloomberg article, it's that the initial audience for Quibi has been older and more female than executives anticipated. The most popular shows have been The Rachel Hollis Show, a daily program by some author, and then Chrissy's Court, which is the courtroom comedy, which Chrissy Teigen resolves petty disputes. I mean, I don't think that Quibi thought that would be their main audience. Nothing wrong with the audience. I think that they are hitting a different audience than expected. And I mean, it just shows that they didn't do as good as job of their market research as they should have in focus groups and testing and stuff like that. But when your audience is a completely different, age demographic from what you expected, I mean, that's kind of a huge thing. So yeah, they got a long way to go. And it's funny how the end of the article ends with, they're going to submit a few of their shows for Emmy Awards. Like, I just found how they're still shooting for awards when they barely have a business set up. So changing their content is worse. And for me, hearing from you that their advertisers want new rates and that they're concerned, it's a lot. So Quibi's definitely been the poster child of how to not launch. And you'd think that would be because of tech issues of launching and failing of something like that. But no, it's the executive team is definitely misread where the market thinks that their service is going to fit. So just a lot of worrisome things with Quibi, and hopefully that they can turn it around quickly. But there's a global pandemic right now. I mean, a lot of places are shut down for work. Slowly reopening, but still shut down. And if they're going to retool their content, like, they obviously want to do that soon-ish. And how are they going to fulfill all that? Write a whole bunch of new shows, film that content, edit it. Like, that's a lot of work to do in a short amount of time. So I'm curious how they're going to solve that problem as well. Just, man, Quibi, poster child, not how to launch.
All right, so then jumping over to HBO Max, we have a bunch of stuff to go over. HBO Max has picked up a show called Homeschool Musical, Class of 2020. The premise of this show is that musicals that would have happened this spring within high schools across the country, they obviously didn't, so they're doing a home version of the musicals and giving them a platform on HBO Max. Young Sheldon, the spin-off from Big Bang Theory, that show has landed at HBO Max for streaming. HBO Max picked up the streaming rights for that show. There's a it's actually a very long interview at The Verge with HBO Max head Tony Goncalves. I'm probably saying that wrong. He talks about the launch. He does not mention any numbers, despite the fact how hard Julia Alexander over at The Verge tried to get numbers out of him. He did not talk about numbers. When he was asked about 4K and some of the other additional features, he also didn't say there is any sort of timetable for that. However, HBO Max has actually said in previous, not specifically him, but other executives have actually said that is part of their roadmap to get to 4K and to have Dolby Atmos and things like that. But at the exact moment, it's not part of their launch, and that wasn't something they were focusing on. But they are, planning on having that in the future. But he didn't have any further details on that. Outside of that, there was a specific quote that I thought was really interesting. There was some talk about whether or not the streaming wars and the competition that he's dealing, or that HBO Max and obviously in conjunction he as an executive are dealing with. They specifically asked, how does it feel being at war with all of these other companies? And he specifically said, we're not at war. We're just in a period of change in how consumers engage with content. And I thought it's very poignant, and obviously it holds very true. It's not necessarily, like, we obviously call ourselves the streaming wars. It's not because we're sitting here talking about who's winning this week. Is it this company or is it that company? Who's winning the battle?
It's just provocative, and it's going to hopefully get people to check us out.
Exactly. And the intent is... honestly, the entire intent is just to talk about all these different companies and how they're trying to achieve their, the best possible version of themselves that they can. And it's not necessarily, like, obviously they're all fighting for market share, because there is obviously a limit on how much market share there is. But this is still a growing, industry, in the sense of, a market share of 50 million people might be what you might assume it is, but honestly, there's 300 million people in America. There are over 300 million people in America. There's 6 billion people worldwide, and while not everybody has the available accessibility to internet and to the ability to have these services, just because of the limit on where they're currently available, there is a large group of people who have access to this content at any given time and these services. And so the idea is that as time progresses, we are obviously here to see how things go and to discuss it. But I was just joking with Tony before we started about this exec at HBO Max said, we're not at war. And I was like, yeah, it'd probably be a little bit disingenuous for us to call ourselves the streaming period of change and how consumers engage with content, because it just doesn't flow off the tongue.
This streaming change, that doesn't really work. And, we got our loyal listeners, but it's going to be hard to grow if we don't have a provocative title. I think Streaming Wars is an apt name because I think it's still at the end of the day, it is a war. And as much as executives say that they're not in competition with others, it's clearly a competition. Come on. Of course it's a competition. They're your business rivals. And what they do influences kind of what you do. Now, maybe not super ingrained, but they all keep eyes on each other. They all know how each other is doing. And they definitely have more teams more dedicated than us to figure out what their competitors are doing. So it is a war. They just might
and they're
be
obviously
and
the other
too
part
nice
of it is,
to say that. Yeah,
and they're obviously reacting to each other's decisions too. If Netflix decides tomorrow that they no longer want to continue to pay a large amount of money for a popular series, somebody else could come along and easily decide that they're going to do it because Netflix is no longer doing it. It's always a cause and effect, and that's the reality of it. That's what this is, and that's obviously what we're here to discuss.
I think this is the first public interview that I have read of Tony Goncalves. It was a little bit of a rough start. I mean, I understand all of his bullet points. They follow a lot with John Stanky and in his position of what the streaming wars are, and which they aren't wars, and kind of how HBO Max is supposed to fit in this new streaming age. So it was nice to hear kind of some, unlike like Quibi, it seems like all the executives across the teams have a shared vision and have communicated that very well, and they all understand where they're supposed to be. This interview was a little bit tense, and maybe that's just me reading it. It might be live, it was a little bit different, but it seemed like the interviewer was trying to push the boundary, and he was very standoffish. But HBO Max, I think after getting the launch out and the initial numbers, I think we'll start to hear more different features that are going to be released. I was a little bit surprised when he mentioned in the interview that he wasn't going to like run down a feature list of what they got planned. Like, that's what people want to know. Like, I'm about to get a 4K TV in a few days. Like, can I get HBO Max and watch whatever content I want in 4K? Like, that's kind of a big deal, which we know will happen eventually. But, I think there's one thing that they can learn from Quibi is that Quibi either didn't promise or they just promised vaguely of like, yeah, we're going to do casting at some point in time in the future. We have all these plans. And I think researchers, analysts, and just consumers wanted some type of a date, like in the next quarter we're going to launch 4K or something. Just people don't need everything in the immediate, and I think as consumers, I think there's some views where consumers want everything now. It's like, I think that there is a little bit of trust and understanding that this is a new service, technology is hard, stuff like that, and we understand like, okay, as long as you're going to do it in the future, I can see worth that investment of that $15 every month. I don't know, in 3 months I'm going to be able to get 4K content, and I can wait 3 months until I get Game of Thrones in 4K. I think consumers understand that trade-off, but just promising vaguely in the future that, hey, we're going to offer 4K sometime in the future or some other product, like, that's a little bit of a tough sell. And I kind of wish that he, as HBO Max head, would have given a little bit of broad dates on that, but I understand why he didn't. It's just it's a very weird, intense interview that we could probably have a whole, major main discussion on.
All right, so then another thing that came out was the show Love Life. This is the Anna Kendrick fronted show on that was one of the originals that premiered with HBO Max. They actually moved up their release schedule. Originally, they planned on having the release schedule be, they had the first 3 episodes premiere with the service, and then they were planning on releasing new episodes every single Thursday, I believe, for the coming weeks until their entire season did its run. They're going to continue to release 3 episodes every week, and then the final week will have 4 episodes. I can say with certainty I've never ever actually heard of this happening before with typical shows that release on a weekly schedule. The only other time even close that I've heard of something, but this was pre-planned, it wasn't something that they moved up, was on DC Universe. They had a series called Young Justice. They were releasing multiple episodes per week in 3-episode chunks at different times. But that was always planned that way. It didn't change.
To be fair, that was 26 or something different.
Yes.
Animated episodes of 30 minutes. It's
exactly.
Not like a live action content.
Yeah, so that's the other part of it. But I tweeted this out on Saturday, which was, the planned weekly release schedule is already adjusting. How long until top originals start dropping entire seasons? My guess is as soon as production resumes and allows for it. Because ultimately, that was one of the big things that HBO Max said that they were going to do. They were going to hold true to the weekly release schedule. similar in the way that HBO releases their content in a weekly format. They don't typically drop an entire season of a show. They, however, will release a new episode every single week until that season's up. HBO Max said they were going to do the exact same thing.
When you only got like one major show that's hitting, like you gotta.
I would agree that you do have to get it out there just to keep people, keep their quell the popularity, but also get people to remain interested in the service. The other shows, I read a report saying the other shows that are very popular on the service, the Looney Tunes cartoon shorts are extremely popular. That was actually the top series on the service when it initially launched. The Not So Late Night with Elmo, that series was second, and then flipping back and forth with Love Life. So the thing is, those shows aren't necessarily moving up their release schedule. I believe the Looney Tunes cartoons shorts, they dropped all of what they were originally planning on dropping all at once. They weren't releasing in a weekly format. The Elmo show, however, is releasing in a weekly format. I honestly think that they can't do this with every show, even if they wanted to, because there is a limit on how much content they have in the pipeline in the immediate future. We do know that there's more content, more original content that is coming in mid-June, late June into July. So there's more content that's on its way. So speeding up the release schedule for this one show isn't going to necessarily affect the fact they have nothing and it's, they won't have anything to release, because they will have more content in the coming weeks. But it is showing that if a show is popular enough, HBO Max is not opposed to releasing it in larger chunks and potentially even eventually getting to the point where they can release an entire season, because we know most services, except for Disney Plus, most services work in a binge format. I say that, and then as I'm thinking about this, obviously CBS All Access releases their stuff in a weekly format too, just like Disney Plus. But Amazon and Netflix, their stuff releases in, a giant clump. It's one, generally speaking, it is a group of the entire season or an entire part of a season or whatever all at once for you to binge. And there's been a lot of pushback from the traditional media, like with Disney and Warner Media, and obviously with CBS, Viacom CBS, where that doesn't benefit them in the long term, especially when they're still building up the amount of original content that they can have. So I think this is only a matter of time before we start seeing more popular shows do this, and then the consistent content that will continue on a weekly basis will just probably end up being the HBO content that is already releasing on a weekly basis, because they can't drop all of an HBO series, an HBO specific series, not an HBO Max series, but they can't drop an entire HBO series on HBO Max, because that would dilute the ability to have HBO as a premium channel on a cable service. So we'll see what happens with this, but I honestly think that this is proof that they are more flexible with the release schedule than they initially made back in October.
I think it's a smart decision. I know The Mandalorian was, I think, kind of an outlier when it comes to normal weekly episodic television having such huge social media buzz, but a lot of the shows that have really dominated social media the past couple of years have been binged. Have been dumped all in one night. Netflix has done this a lot, and then you got other players that do it. And I understand for a mass adoption standpoint and social media and hype and all that stuff, the draw for releasing a bunch of episodes all at once and people can just get through it and enjoy it and all that stuff. But I also understand from a business standpoint and wanting to keep subscribers on your service for as long as possible, while releasing episodic. And I think that releasing 3 to 4 episodes of a season every week, depending on how many episodes there are, I can see that striking a balance in between the two of you still generate that social media push that you get from some of these shows that you drop all at one time, but you're also able to keep subscribers on for more than just one huge weekend of binging. You keep them for a couple more weeks. So this is a very interesting middle ground. We've never seen a company do this to this extreme, especially for live action content. I think animation doesn't really count in this discussion. So I'm curious how the numbers for Love Life will be in terms of social media impact. We know that I think Pair Analytics looks into the social media impact of these different shows. And I'm also curious the normal, television ratings or the normal ratings that or analytics that they have in-house of how they judge these shows. So I think that this might, if this works well for HBO Max, we could see this be adopted in other platforms. So I'm curious for this experiment and how it's going to go.
All right, and then finally with HBO Max, AT&T has announced that HBO Max will be exempt as part of mobile data caps. So if you are an AT&T customer and you are watching HBO Max using your mobile device, anything that you consume using HBO Max will not count towards your data limit for the month. So if you have a data limit, stream away on HBO Max because it won't count. While Netflix, of course, and the other streaming services, they will definitely count against your data cap. So
this is a benefit of the service's big boss owning, broadband telecom. They're able to do this type of things. I think it's a great way to bring synergy to your business, and how each business can help each other out. HBO Max is a great selling point for AT&T in selling AT&T branded phones. And then getting the service is also great because you can realize that, hey, it's not going to affect my data cap plans. I'm just curious for the implications for the future for a fair internet. This reminds me back a few years ago when Netflix and Comcast got in a pretty big fight about Comcast wanted to essentially pay Netflix to keep the internet speeds the same, and if not, that they were going to slow them down. That's kind of where this situation, that's how I see it. And it's like, oh, there's interesting implications that could happen of, the telecom owning the content and they're prioritizing their own. And even though they're not truly prioritizing in the way of like, we're pushing this one first, it's, hey, we're not going to charge data cap hits, or this is not going to charge on your account if you use our service. So it's kind of an interesting way to prioritize your service. So there's so many interesting potential pitfalls that this choice will follow. And I'm just curious how that's going to land in the future. Curious how it's going to land for, companies outside the United States, because they might have different laws. I don't know. There's just so many different implications here, all the way from, the FTC or the FCC getting involved, or just we're going to see Comcast maybe do something on their own. I don't know. Just to me, this is pretty huge, and it raises a few red flags. Reminds me back of that Netflix Comcast kerfuffle. But hey, if you're got AT&T phone, this is a great deal. Get HBO Max. Doesn't affect your data cap.
Yeah, I wouldn't say, I don't know that this is...
Because I could see this happening with broadband, and because AT&T also does broadband. It's like, hey, you can stream, HBO Max, gets preferred access on AT&T, fiber or broadband or something versus the other competitors.
I do remember there was a variety of different situations with mobile companies where certain mobile companies were offering free access to content. T-Mobile had a Netflix deal where they were accessing it. And at the time, they specifically, part of the deal was, we are offering you this free streaming service, or at least a credit for that streaming service. And if you use this streaming service on our thing, it won't count towards your cap. I remember T-Mobile being very adamant about the deals that they had with certain streaming services, and I believe Netflix was one of them at the time, where if you had Netflix and you got it free through T-Mobile, they did not use Netflix to towards your data allotment for the month. And so this is not something necessarily new, but I definitely do agree that AT&T is obviously bigger than somebody like T-Mobile because they cross over into that broadband side and the fiber side of things, and that obviously presents some potential issues in the future. Comcast obviously could say this. You could say the same thing about Comcast with Peacock, because they could offer the exact same thing and say, well, if you have Peacock, we won't use it won't count towards your data limits for the month. And yeah. I don't see an issue with that. Honestly, it's a great way for these companies to promote their services. Is it a downfall for companies that don't have that aren't necessarily associated with the service? Certainly it is, but I don't know that it ultimately is. I don't think personally there's anything wrong with this at this moment.
I guess my concern is definitely in the future. I'm forward thinking the scenario and just going down all the circumstances of what could happen, and I'm just concerned as we walk down this road, as the streaming continues, and telecoms and broadband providers own and create more content. Just the type of future that we could have without decent regulation. So that's just my concerns for the future is kind of going down all those different paths. But yes, in the immediate, this is great for AT&T.
All right, so we have nothing for Peacock. As far as niche streaming services, the WWE Network has shifted their strategy with a new free tier Now, their service for the longest time was $9.99, and that included their monthly pay-per-views that they offered as well. Now they have a free tier, which you will not get the monthly pay-per-views, but you will have access to a number of library content, as well as a variety of original shows that are not necessarily new, but were original to the network when the network launched, and over the last couple of years has added more original content. In addition to that, also people are switching to digital for sports, which means ESPN Plus is growing. They've obviously had their share of deals in place, but the point is that ESPN Plus could end up having about 15 million viewers by the end of this year, and that is a huge group, or a huge jump up over the last couple of years, as they were hovering, I think, between 2 and 3 million for a really long time. Obviously, the bundle between Hulu and Disney Plus has helped them grow as well. But this isn't just ESPN Plus either, also Sling TV, Hulu with Live TV, YouTube TV. These are all services that do offer sports content available through their live TV options. And that is something that a lot of people are utilizing rather than just sticking strictly to broadcast options that are legacy options that are previously available. As far as other streaming providers, we've got two real quick things. Sling TV gets a new president as their subscriber numbers continue to drop. Roku is now offering a live guide. This is basically in reaction to what we currently see with Pluto TV, Tubi TV, Zumo, all of these different services that offer free content. Now there's a live option available for you to check out what's available within Roku apps that are available on the Roku store. Jumping into some discussions, we've got a bunch of different things that we actually wanted to discuss, but like I said, there was a ton of news here that we all ready to discuss. So while we planned on talking about HBO Max reviews, I'm going to hold off on talking about that, but I will give you just a quick excerpt of what to expect. Basically, a tech site basically said this is the beginning of something really great. A lot of analysts said there's a lot to be desired, but overall, it was just kind of like a wait-and-see approach is basically the majority of what people are saying. But we're going to talk more about that next week. I wanted to quickly bring up the HBO Max catalog. There was some word that, if you remember correctly, back in October, they announced a bunch of content that was going to be available exclusively on the service when it launched. Turns out some of that content wasn't actually available. The content they revealed weeks before the launch that they said was going to be available, there were some gaps in that content that was actually available on the day of release. Because it was, of course, the end of the month, content that was licensed through HBO that was on the service is immediately leaving, and then new content is already coming through because it's a new month with June. So there's a ton of content that is missing. They're working on trying to get a new list of content that is currently available for people to search if they're looking for something specific. Obviously, if you go to the service itself and search, you'll find the content you're looking for. Now, the main story that we want to talk about is the AT&T and Amazon showdown. Now, the basis of this discussion is going to be probably not as long as we anticipated, because we're already hovering around an hour, and I don't want to make the episode too long. But I've been following the entertainment strategy guy on Twitter. I strongly suggest you check him out if you're not following him. He has a website that he posts a lot of different articles related to basically everything we talk about here and more. He talks about in-depth related to more entertainment side of things. He also talks about some other things related to the entertainment companies. So like he'll bring up stuff related to the Disney parks and things like that. There's a lot of stuff that he talks about, but the vast majority of what he has been talking about for a while specifically deals with the streaming services and the businesses around them. One of his main things that he does is at the end of the week, he has an article that's like the most important story of the week, and then he talks about it, and then he'll briefly mention some other stories that he would have talked about if there wasn't a larger story to talk about. The big talk last week was HBO Max and Amazon having kind of like a fight. Basically, if just get you caught up in case you don't remember, HBO Max launched. It wasn't on the Amazon devices or on Prime or anything, within devices or within the operating system. That's the important part to highlight, is that it wasn't available on either one of those. But Amazon decided to come out the day of launch and state that just because there wasn't a deal in place, they wanted to make it known that they were not the ones that were at fault. It was HBO and Warner Media who was at fault for this, because Amazon's principle was, if you already subscribe to HBO, you should be allowed to get the same exact content as anybody else and not have to change anything else. But really, the biggest problem with the entire Amazon HBO Max situation is that there's two sides of this. HBO Max is creating content for for their service. They in turn are expecting to get, subscribers. And part of their subscribers is not just the fact that they're paying a subscription fee, but it's also the fact that they're getting the data that allows them to create better content to reach a better group of customers and things like that. The way Amazon's operating system works is, if you subscribe to HBO through, as a Prime channel within Amazon, you can basically go into Prime and you can search a specific thing. You could search Game of Thrones, and Game of Thrones will pop up searchable along with all of the other content that Amazon offers, or in the other channels that you subscribe to. There's no interface that is HBO specific. It's just Amazon's interface, meaning HBO has no way of controlling how their content is seen or what content is seen alongside at any given time because of this situation. With HBO Max and the app itself, they can control that. So one of the points of contention in all of this situation was that one of the things that HBO Max wanted was they wanted their app to be a standalone service within the Amazon environment, so that they could control how their content is presented. They can also get the data that customers, of what customers are watching, how they're watching the content, how they're consuming the content, and things like that. So that is a very important thing for the company, of course, who's creating the content. Now, when you look at it from the other perspective, Amazon is in a situation where they're looking at it from, well, we bring you customers, so we require some of this too. And now, in most situations, like we talked about earlier, there's either a 70-30 split or an 80-20 split, depending on how much how it works out. But that basically means out of the $15 that HBO Max is charging per month, Amazon's actually walking away with $3 or $4, depending on what the actual break is. That's a significant amount of money for just basically providing the option of being able to consume the content. Plus, they're getting the data. So personally, I would be on the side of HBO Max in the sense of it makes sense for them to have not necessarily toe the line with other channels that exist within the Amazon ecosystem. And it makes sense that they would have wanted to try to get to a point where either the money deal works a little bit better for them, where instead of a 70-30 split, it's an 80-20 split. And then they keep the content the way it is, or they, go the route of they want the content presented the way they want with the interface that they have, rather than it being viewable within the Amazon environment. I personally think HBO Max is in the right here. It also sets a standard because, let's be honest, there are other providers out there that they don't necessarily have as big of a concern about this. The one thing you never really hear Disney talking about is the data. They don't really talk about how important the data is. But when you hear Warner Media talking about HBO Max, Xander is brought up all the time about how important it is for their success is this data that they get that is anonymized and then, basically used to create other content for the services. Peacock was saying the exact same thing during their investor presentation back in January, was that they were all, the data is very important. It's almost as important as the amount of money that they're bringing in every single month, because it helps them determine what type of content to create. So Amazon, as a device manufacturer, as a operating system business, they obviously have reason to try to, hold their ground and not give up what they have. But the thing is, it does feel slightly disingenuous, because it makes it seem like Amazon is one of these cable companies that is basically saying, no, we're not going to air this channel anymore because we don't like the terms of the deal. It makes sense, especially for Amazon, who has a large number of HBO subscribers that are specifically using them as the platform that delivers the content to them. It makes sense for them to try to use that larger count of subscribers as a reason for keeping their terms more favorable in their direction. But as HBO Max grows, they need the information. They need to have their product shown the way that they want it to in order for it to be successful. They can't just have it as part of the larger Amazon ecosystem. That doesn't necessarily benefit them long term. So ultimately, it's a great article to check out. I'm probably missing a ton of stuff because I'm trying to breeze through this, but I would strongly suggest checking out the article. The article's obviously in the show notes for you guys to check out. It is super in-depth, gives a great rundown of everything that the conflicts between this situation between HBO Max and Amazon, and the bullet points of why it's so important for each company to stand their ground and try to make this work. Now, that's not to say, as we've said before, Amazon and Roku, they most likely will come to some sort of terms with HBO Max down the line, not necessarily next week, not necessarily next month. We don't know, but eventually they will probably, one side will give some, and then the other side will accept the fact that they've given enough, and that'll be the end of it, and then they'll end up with the apps within the services. But I think for the time being, it's just this is a show of power. We have the content, you don't have the content. If Amazon doesn't have this content for long enough and they start to get some really big hits, you could see people unsubscribe from the Amazon version and go straight over to the just HBO Max standalone version, which allows them to get the content along with everything they were already getting through Amazon. So it's a unique situation, but it shows in a lot of ways the future of how these services are going to have to interact with each other. For the longest time, it was a cable channel having conflicts with the cable providers. Now we're in a situation where it's the streaming services having conflicts with the companies that are providing access to the streaming services. And there's enough customers that are using those products to access the content. It can put a huge dent in the amount of subscribers you potentially could have. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Dustin, I agree with you a lot about the fight between Amazon and HBO Max. I don't think one party is in the wrong. I think there's one I personally agree with more, and that is HBO Max's. But from a business side, I think both companies are doing what's best in their own interests, and I personally respect that. I think in comparison to maybe Disney Plus, which is I think a good comparison in terms of all these different issues with Amazon, the thing that with Disney Plus is that they're not launching an ad-supported, version of their service in the future. And we know HBO Max is doing that, and that's why the data is so important. Is not necessarily just for in-house, original content. I think that yes, HBO makes a lot of shows and they license them out to others, but when it comes to developing your own content, you do need that data so that okay, like where should we go, where should we move? Netflix is the king of that. But I think that what makes this so interesting is that HBO Max, everyone knows that they are in the future going to launch an ad-supported, and we know that Roku wants a piece of the ad money, but for ads you need the data, and HBO Max wants that data necessarily to give it to Xander to do all the analysis and to get ads and show ads to the right people. Like there's a lot of moving parts there, and that's why the data is so important. But for Amazon's sake, we've seen this in the retail side with Amazon, is that they will sell other people's products, take the data from their products, and then make in-house products and compete directly with the other products that they're selling on their platform. Like that's a discussion of, is that right or wrong, is totally different. The point is that that's what they've done. It's part of their business playbook. And I could see HBO Max being a little bit concerned is that, okay, like we're going to use their platform and that they're going to get our data about our shows and then create shows based off of that data. And so I could see why that could be concerning. So, I think that this is going to be resolved quickly. I think personally, the fight that I want to see resolved quicker is the Roku HBO Max. I have a personal stake in that because I have a Roku, but even more so, there are more people who watch content on Rokus than Fire devices. But this Amazon HBO Max dispute is going to be resolved quickly. At most, I don't see this going longer than a month personally. So just curious how it's gonna go down.
All right, so like I said, definitely check out the article. The link is in the show notes. We'll probably be hearing a lot more from the entertainment strategy guy in the near future because There's always new content coming out that he's posting up. So with all of that being said, there is a small group of trailers that have released over the past week. That is also in the show notes over on the website. In addition to that, you can follow us on Twitter and join our Discord for all latest articles that we talk about here on the podcast and some that we don't. You can follow us on Instagram for all the latest announcements related to new episodes of the podcast releasing. You can send us emails with any questions, comments, concerns, feedback, or anything else that you'd like us to talk about on future episodes at thestreamingwars@gmail.com. Our website is thestreamingwars.io, and that is where you can find the extensive show notes that we have to offer. This podcast is available on all types of podcast platforms as well as YouTube, so definitely subscribe and leave feedback wherever you are listening to this episode. With all of that being said, with everything going on in the world today, please guys, stay safe out there, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to The Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.